Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started.
So in the absence of much iOS news this week, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Mac. As I've mentioned before, I've been getting slowly into with a couple of small utility apps. The first one being Quitter, which I launched, a month ago, something like that. And now I'm working on a basic podcast post-production tool. I wanted to talk a little bit about the considerations behind selling this Mac app potentially in the near future, both releasing it to the public, polishing it up, and then whether to charge money for it. Do I sell it in the Mac App Store versus non-Mac App Store? Do I worry about piracy? Stuff like that. The first concern I had is, do I want to release this app to the public at all? When you're in the middle of building an app and you're like, oh, this is kind of fun, you might think, it's right now, I've gotten it to a point where I can use it and it's kind of done for a while. And then you might use it for a while. You might share with a couple of friends or something like that. And you might think, oh, okay, I should release this. This is useful. The difference between like the point you're at that moment where like you have the app working for you and maybe a couple other people versus something that is releasable, that's a very, very wide gap. And I learned this when I did Quitter, where I had like this basic Apple script first, and then I had this basic menu bar app, and I thought, other people might find this useful. I should release this. And to get from that point to releasable in a responsible and pleasant and likely to succeed way was so much work. Because what you don't realize when you have the initial app, you don't realize that there are like all the edge cases that you're not considering because like you don't use them yourself. Edge cases, we had a whole show on edge cases. there's all the edge cases you're not considering, and the standards for what is good enough are way lower when it's just you or your friends using an app. Like what's good enough with the UI, what's good enough with input handling, with edge case handling. In general, you just need far less polish. And then other stuff like that you don't even think of at first, but that could be a lot of work or expense or just a hassle is, a private app for yourself doesn't need a public name. It doesn't need a decent icon. It doesn't need documentation. You don't need to worry about distribution. It doesn't need a website. It doesn't need like an auto updater feed, stuff like that. And once you have it working for yourself, it basically doesn't need any maintenance because you know all the limitations. You avoid them yourself, and it works for you, and you consider it done. If you release it to the public, you have to go through this massive polishing stage. It seems like, this weekend I'll polish it up and get it out there. In practice, it usually takes a lot of time. Like you typically underestimate that time. It's not easy or fast. And once the app goes public, people will have expectations for it. They will start emailing you feature requests. They will expect improvements to all the bugs that you didn't find because you didn't hit any of the edge cases. And what started out as a simple idea of, I've made this app for myself, maybe I'll release it, that can quickly balloon into a much larger project. Like what happened with Quitter, like there was a lot of temptation that Quitter as it is right now works fine for me, but there was immediate temptation once I released it and started getting all these people saying, oh man, this is great. It'd be even better if it did this. Or, man, you could really make this into a bigger thing by adding this. And it quickly became very tempting to take this, what was this very basic little utility app, and to try to make it its own bigger product. But then, of course, like, do I have time for that bigger product? Do I want to even be in that business? Like, I'd start competing with a whole other market of products that, frankly, I don't know anything about. I don't know what it's like to compete in that market. Do I really want to be doing that? Like, it's a whole different ball game. Can I spare the time from my other projects that I want to be doing to turn this thing into a bigger thing that other people are asking for that might be tempting? It's a very hard balance to find, and it can so easily get totally out of control before you even step back and realize, wait a minute, do I even want to be doing this as a big app? Or do I want to just keep it as this little thing that I spend, a few days on once and then never touch again?
This is a lesson that I've had to learn many, many times. I have the tendency to build anything I can think of. And several times I've built something and put it out into the It's like I get it to that point where you're talking about, where it's like it's sort of done, it's useful enough, it's kind of at that cross that functional threshold, maybe you'd say.
Right. Done is in the biggest quotation marks ever.
Yeah, it's like it's sort of functional, maybe is a better word than done.
Yes.
And I'm like, okay, maybe I'll release this. Maybe I'll put this out in the store. Maybe I'll maybe other people would find it useful. But the thing that I find that I now have, maybe, it might be a bit strong to call it the wisdom, but I've been caught up with it enough times to know that there's a difference in the way you approach building something. If you're building it as a product versus if you're building it just as like on a lark, just a little hobby project, a little experimentation, a little prototype, something like that. You have to be more thoughtful. You have to think about how it's going to be used, and what even answering questions for, what is a typical user going to be, and optimizing it for them. And sometimes it's great if you are the typical user, I suppose. But if you're not, then, it starts to get really squishy and tricky to make sure that you're actually building a product that other people would know how to use. And, I have many utilities and things that I've never released, but I use myself, or at least or perhaps moreover, what will happen is I'll build something, use it for myself for a long time, and then take like the lesson learned from using it and turn it into fold it into a product. But the actual product part is going to be very different, like necessarily. And so it's definitely a tricky thing to look at something and say, do I actually want this to exist outside of my own use, or at least, my close friends or family? Like there's a couple of apps or tools that I use that, that only exist on my wife and my phone. And that's fine. Like they don't have to be products. They can just be things.
Honestly, what is that number? I'm curious. It's probably a lot.
It's probably a handful.
I mean, most people, that number is zero. So like,
sure, it's greater than zero. And a lot of these things, like I said, are it's fighting the temptation to, anytime you have an idea, to rush it out to market versus trying to use it yourself for a while and seeing if it actually is something. So a lot of times when these things will ultimately end up being a product or will be a part of a bigger product, but they start life as just things to keep close, because I used to rush things out. I mean, that's part of why I ended up with the problem of having dozens and dozens of apps in the App Store, because anytime I had an idea, I'd build it, I'd put it out. And to start with, I had the mindset of, well, if you never know what's going to be a hit, maybe I should just always push things out and let the market tell me if it's useful or cool. The problem with that is, like, what if the market tells me that what I'm doing is like useful and cool, but in a very different way, or with a very different slant than I want to actually use or build a product for? Then I'm kind of like stuck into that. And also, I guess there's a really weird thing of, like, is it reasonable to put something out that I don't have expectations to support, for example? Or like, what level of support do I expect to provide for something? Is this just, if it's just something I built on a lark and put out into the world, it's, there's always, especially if you put it into into the App Store or something like that, then there's a certain expectation, I think, that people naturally have for what they should get from that. And so it definitely makes sense for, as you're going through this process of, do I want this thing that I find useful to actually exist in the world, to make sure you have a good answer to that do I want to support this? Do I want to chase down the various bugs and issues that people are having? Are people going to use this in a professional context, for example, where if there's a problem, there's potentially financial implications or more serious things that could go wrong? In Twitter, if it doesn't quit Twitter for somebody, that's probably not a big deal. But if you're doing an app that could have a bigger implication if it goes wrong, like, there's some weird, more like liability type of questions that you have to be comfortable with before you'd move forward into a broader distribution.
Exactly. And all of those, all the problems of, are you willing to support this, and are you ready to support it? All of those things really do apply, whether it's free or paid. Although I will say, though, whether you charge money at all makes a big difference in the type of expectations and entitlement that your customers will feel to things like, quality. Like if somebody pays for an app, they're certainly going to expect, it better be good, it better work and have good features. It also better not crash or have bugs that they can notice. They expect you to support it ongoing, with updates, with maintenance, and also, as you mentioned, support. If people paid for an app, even if they only paid $1, they expect a certain level of support. I mean, heck, people expect support for free apps, but they expect a lot more for paid apps. It's not proportional to the different, they don't, if they paid $1 versus paying nothing, they don't expect like $1 more support. They expect a lot more support. Psychologically, people are very protective of having spent money on something, and they really get angry if it doesn't match to their expectations if they paid even just $1 for it. And the good thing is, on the Mac you can charge more, but charging more brings on even higher expectations. So, if you are what I would consider like a cheap app. So on iOS, this would probably be like less than $3 maybe. On the Mac, I'd say under $10 probably. That is like one level of expectations of, quality, updates, support. If you charge, what I would call real money, and that the perception of what real money is will vary by your market. But, I'd say on iOS, maybe $10, on the Mac, maybe $50. If you're charging that, that kind of like what people think of as real money, you will be held to much higher expectations. If people just paid you $10 for your iOS app and it doesn't work on the phone they buy next month, they're going to be mad. Like they're going to be really, and understandably so, because they pay what they believe is a premium price, and you better be supporting that. If they spend $50 on your Mac app and they email you with a question and you don't answer that email, that's going to look really bad for you in their eyes, and they're going to get very angry about that. And so you have to really consider all this. And then, this goes back to trying to estimate your market, as we talked about in the ideas episode. Trying to estimate your market of given all the overhead of making a paid app and selling a paid app, am I likely to actually get enough copies sold to make enough money from this that it will be worth all that overhead in my business and in my life? And is that really worth it or not? And it might be easy to rationalize, I made this app, it's kind of useful, I should charge $10 for it or whatever. Or on iOS, I should charge $2 for it or whatever. By the way, that multiple makes me sad, but that's the reality. But anyway, so there's that temptation. I could charge a few bucks for it and make a little bit of money. But the reality is, making that money, charging that price, will have costs to you. And you need to make sure that you are being realistic about your expectations of how many copies am I really going to sell, and is that going to be worth making that a few $100s that I might make from this, or whatever it might be.
And if you end up with saying that it's not, then you have the weird question of if I make it free, then why am I even releasing it? Fair enough, there's a certain altruism or being, or maybe exposure or marketing angles that you could
long-term reputation marketing kind of things,
or those types of, or bigger, in broader sort of play. I mean, sort of in the way that Overcast is a free app with in-app purchases in it to support its development. But you've said many times that you made it free to try and establish it as a big player in the space, because you had other motivations for that you wanted the platform to stay competitive and open. And so that can be worthwhile, even though it's not financially, directly the financial incentive is there. But there is a weird thing, or you'll end up with people who will be like, well, then why don't you just open source it? It's well, then you kind of have two problems. You have the source code and developer problem, as well as the customer facing problem. And you have to manage and deal with those types of things, that it gets really complicated to a point that you have to decide, why am I doing this? And you have to have a good answer, a good concise answer for why would I want this to exist in the world? And if you have a good answer, awesome. If you don't, maybe it's not worth doing.
Our sponsor this week is Pingdom. Start monitoring your websites and servers today at pingdom.com/radar. You get a 14-day free trial, and if you use code RADAR at checkout, you get 20% off your first invoice. Pingdom is focused on making the web faster and more reliable for everyone who has a site by offering powerful and easy-to-use monitoring tools and services. If you're a Pingdom user, monitoring the availability and performance of your server, database, or website is a breeze. They use more than 70 global test servers that emulate visits to your site, checking its availability as often as every minute. So you can check all sorts of things. You can check the whole site. You can check certain parts of it, things like e-commerce checkouts, contact forms, logins, search, and they make it possible to monitor all of these things with performance metrics, with uptime reports, and all sorts of customization of how you can customize the requests and what kind of things they're looking for, what kind of requirements, if you need to require certain strings on the page. It is incredibly useful. And Pingdom detects tons of outages for their customers, more than 400,000 a day. You probably need Pingdom in your life if you run any kind of service or website. So regardless of whether you have a small website or you're managing like a big infrastructure, it is very important to monitor its performance. All Pingdom needs is the URL that you want to monitor, and they take care of the rest. When they detect an outage, you're alerted in lots of customizable ways, but more importantly, you're alerted quickly. So you can fix the error before the downtime affects you and your customers any further. You don't want to be caught out when somebody wants to access your site and all of a sudden it's down, and you don't want to be hearing from people on Twitter saying it's down. You need to know that first so you can fix it before too many of your customers see it. So you need Pingdom. Check it out today, and you will be the first to know if your site is down. Go to pingdom.com/radar. That's pingdom.com/radar for a 14-day free trial. Use code RADAR to get 20% off at checkout. David and I are both Pingdom customers. I've been using them now for something like 8 years, and I love them. They're great. Thank you very much to Pingdom for sponsoring our show. All right, so assuming that you have decided that you want to release your app and that you want to charge money for it, and that it's a Mac app, so iOS, that's a whole other ballgame. We'll talk about that in other shows. Suppose you want to charge money for a Mac app. How do you do that, and where do you do that? The most obvious first choice is the Mac App Store. The Mac App Store, though, as we know by now, the Mac App Store is a mixed bag. Like the iOS App Store, it builds a big wall between you and your customers, and this has some benefits and some downsides. The obvious benefits are that you don't need to deal with things like basic distribution of versions, updates, and the big thing, you don't have to deal with payment. And those are all substantial gains that you don't have to deal with, because those are all complicated to different degrees. I think payment being probably the most complicated. Not having to deal with that is a huge win. It also kind of acts as a support wall between you and your customers. Like, your customers might not contact you directly. They might go to the Mac App Store for that contact thing, or they might just blame Apple or blame the App Store or whatever else if people have problems. And that's probably a good thing in the immediate term if you don't think about it too much, but in the long term, it's probably a bad thing. Buying from the store, though, a lot of people prefer it. It reduces issues around things like trust. If people don't really trust you, or you don't seem legitimate or large, they might have trouble giving you money, whereas they tend to not have those problems in the app stores. And of course, it's easier for people to install stuff from the App Store usually when it works. They don't have to fish out their license key or anything like that. So many customers do prefer buying from the App Store, and that is not to be underestimated. But for those benefits with the Mac App Store, you pay major costs. It is incredibly inflexible on pricing models, distribution, updates, stuff like that. There's no trials, no paid upgrades. There's a lot of rules. You also have to go through app review to enforce a lot of these rules, and you have to be sandboxed. And these are all pretty major restrictions for a lot of Mac app businesses. A lot of apps just can't be sold through the App Store for some of those requirements, and a lot of them maybe could be, but it would be unwise for them to be sold through the store, or it would be bad business for them. The biggest thing to me is the two biggest things to me. You definitely have less access and knowledge about your customers. It's harder to do things like build an email list for new releases and stuff like that, and it's harder to offer certain people discounts, things like that. And mostly to me, they take a 30% cut, and 30% is a lot. It's easy if we're for those of us who are accustomed to iOS, it's easy to forget or to not really ever think through how much is 30% exactly. So just to give you an example of how much 30% is in practice, suppose you have a really good app. It makes $50,000. Well, you made $50,000. What did the app actually make? So if you got $50,000 from Apple, the app made about $71,000. So you got 50, and Apple got about 21,000. So Apple got almost half of what you got. If you sell outside of an app store, which you can't do on iOS really, but if you do it on the Mac, that 30% cut that is taken by your payment processor goes down to maybe, 3 to 6%, depending on how you're doing it, depending on international support, payment provider, stuff like that. But it goes down, almost an order of magnitude from Apple's cut. So in that example, just to give you some numbers, for your app that you made $50,000 from in the App Store, you would have made about $66,000 from FastSpring or $69,000 from Stripe. So these are not small differences. 30% is a lot. And if Apple brings that 15% cut to a lot more places, that will help a lot. 15% is also a lot, but it's way more competitive than 30 compared to selling it yourself. So the App Store really is, you get a lot of benefits for it, but you do pay dearly for those benefits in a lot of different ways. And for a lot of people, it's just not worth it.
Sure. And the App Store too is this, like, it's a weird thing to have the choice in some ways, coming from an iOS background, where like because I have no choice in the matter, like if I want to make iOS software and give it to someone else unless I'm within a big company and I do an enterprise distribution thing, like the only option is the iOS App Store. So like whatever, like I can lobby and encourage Apple to change policies or to make things happen, but by and large, it's their store, their rules. I do the best I can. But because you have the choice on the Mac App Store, you really start to see the hurdles and the challenges that situation like creates.
Oh yeah, I mean, like, the App Store, it's always kind of been like this carrot and stick balance. On iOS, they don't really need to offer much carrot because the stick is so big. Like on iOS, you have to use the App Store. Period. Like there's no I mean, yes, I guess like Cydia exists, or Cydia, however it's pronounced, but that's not really easy to build businesses there. You're basically stuck with the App Store or nothing on iOS. On the Mac, and even Apple, like they used to tie major features to the App Store, like iCloud, and they just announced WWDC this year that these features are coming to other apps. You don't have to be in the App Store anymore. So it seems like on the Mac, Apple has recently kind of shifted away from keeping much of a stick around there. So now they're relying only on the carrot of like, what are the benefits of being in the Mac App Store? So now you kind of look at it purely on business terms, and I don't think the Mac App Store is a very appealing place for new businesses to go these days. Even the promotional value, I think, has proven to be fairly minimal in actual installation numbers from featured apps. So it's unfortunate because it would have been nice if it worked better, but it does seem like it has both failed in a way that it's most likely to be neglected forever, and that most developers shouldn't go there anymore.
Sure, because I think the thing that I think of when like why would I use the Mac App Store? Like since I now have this choice, like I can decide if I want to go this like A or B or both, like which obviously you can also do. You can sell in both places, but say am going to be in the App Store. Like in my mind, the main reason on the Mac App Store that I would want to be there, and this is speaking mostly just as a customer for like when do I launch the App Store app on my Mac? Is usually it's like if I have a very specific utility or tool in mind, I will go and search in the Mac App Store first. And I do that mostly just because it has that sense of being curated, that somebody else, a impartial, to some definition of impartial, third party has looked at this application and said it meets a basic set of criteria. Don't worry, it's not going, you're not installing malware, you're not installing sort of something that doesn't actually do what it says. It has this basic level of criteria. So if I can find a tool, I'm just trying to do some random operation that I need a utility for, I'll go to the Mac App Store. And if I find it, great, I'll get it from there. If not, then I just go to Google, search around in there, and find it that way. And so the main benefit from being in the Mac App Store, from my perspective, based on my own experience, is just as a marketing tool, just as being in the place that, there's a non-insignificant number of people who may go there and look. And so it's like being on that shelf is useful. But if you're trying to build a business that, you're making your living from something, Mac App Store on its own is unlikely to be the right answer. My guess is you're going to want to be at least in both, if not go your own. And because once you've gone down the road of doing it your own, you can start to realize a lot of benefits, and both in terms of, like you were saying, in terms of the costs and the money you can make, as well as just having so much more flexibility about how things work. You're never stuck in the situation of like, oh, I need to get this, this update, this bug fix update through app review. Even though app review is great and down to like, a day or so now, it's still, a day is still longer than, 1 minute from now, it'll be available on my CDN. And that's kind of nice.
Oh, yeah. And just the flexibility you get of doing it yourself. I mean, the downside is you have to build it yourself. And there are different degrees of building it yourself. Like if you use something like FastSpring or Digital River, formerly Accelerate, or Kagi, like these things, they charge, a little bit more percentage, like a few more percentage points than like direct credit card processing from Stripe or somebody like that. But they take care of a lot of the just payment complexity for you. And you basically just provide serial numbers. And you will have some support costs from these things. You'll have some issues, but probably fewer. From developers I've talked to, there's probably fewer of those than from most places. And so it seems like a very good balance to use a service like this versus like Mac App Store or totally doing it yourself, because you only pay a little bit more and than doing it yourself, and you get a lot. So that's probably what I'm going to try first. Something maybe I was looking at FastSpring earlier, probably them. And then, because you can always change later with these things. Like it's harder to move in or out of the Mac App Store if you change your mind later or if you need to change later. But these kind of services, it's pretty easy to move between. So the costs of trying one out are pretty low. So I want to talk briefly about piracy concerns, because this is something like you don't really have to think about on iOS much, because on iOS, there is iOS piracy, certainly, but it's limited almost completely to the jailbreak community, and you don't really... It's kind of like a losing battle. Like you can't really fight the jailbreak community on piracy, so you're usually better off not even trying. And that is largely true of Mac piracy as well, but not completely. On the Mac, with people using the Mac, like you don't have to be like a special class of user the way you kind of have to like devote a lifestyle to be a jailbreaker. But like on the Mac, you can pirate Mac apps if you really want to, and a lot of people do, and it's easier to do that. And so you do have to worry about that as a Mac software author. You have to worry about piracy and how this will affect your app, how it will affect your customers. And generally, I've talked to a lot of developers about this recently, trying to figure out what I need to do here. And number one is stay out of the Mac App Store, because Mac App Store piracy is rampant because they all use the same wrapper that everyone has cracked a million times, and you kind of can't do much about it as a Mac App Store app. Also, Mac App Store, even without piracy, the Mac App Store license allows for the same Apple ID to install your app on like hundreds of Macs. So that's a big problem if you have a business app where like a whole office full of computers might have your app installed off of one purchase, which is not great. So generally with piracy, like a little goes a long way. You need to do some piracy prevention. You need to have some kind of like license or serial number checking or something like that, just to prevent casual piracy. You need to put up some kind of barrier to make paying you easier for most people than pirating the app. To a large extent, your app will be pirated anyway. And, you can do things like you can scan the internet occasionally, trying to like look for pirated serial numbers of your own app and then ban them in a future build of your app. This is all examples of like low-hanging fruit, like a little goes a long way here. You should have some kind of piracy avoidance mechanism in your app. And this is something you have to worry about with direct distribution. But that's just a cost of doing business, and that's part of. I think that's part of just the reality of a software business on a computer these days. It's less so on mobile, but on a computer, that's still part of why you get paid the big bucks, I guess. And you have to always balance versus legitimate customers versus hurting them. With any kind of piracy prevention system you pick, but. Generally, in summary, I don't know much about this yet, but it does seem like the common wisdom among people is a little goes a long way. You need to do something, but you don't need to go crazy with it.
Sure. And I think that's probably the best path is build something yourself, do something basic, and then just don't worry about it.
Exactly. All right. Well, we're out of time this week. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. I know this is officially an iOS show, but we will occasionally talk about the Mac because it's related. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.